only applied to appliances from a few countries. Retail prices actually fell because companies moved their production to low-cost countries.
You pay attention with so much at stake.
Seas are rising and chronic flooding will be the new normal.
You navigate, you listen, you keep an ear out. You pay attention, and so do we. We tell the stories of our time every day.
In the 26th day of testimony and on the 139th witness, Shahar Tsarnaev wept.
We unearth what would otherwise stay hidden.
There's just a lot of hate in this world, and that day, for that hour, we were humans.
Across the street.
The Red Sox have won the World Series.
And around the globe.
It's here and now.
This is Modern Love.
This is WBUR's All Things Considered.
This is only a game.
This is On Point.
This is Radio Boston.
On air, online, on demand, and on stage in the heart of Boston.
I'm Jack Lepiars. Welcome to WBUR City Space.
Always looking forward, paying attention, and knowing that your story is one of our stories.
Good morning. I'm Bob Oates.
I'm Lisa Mullins.
I'm Meghna Chakrabarty.
I'm Jeremy Hobson.
This is 90.9 WBUR Boston.
Hello, how's everyone doing? Good. My name's Alex Schneps. I am the Events and Programming Manager for City Space. Thank you for being here on this rainy evening for a really good conversation. This is part 3 of a series called Stepping Up: Business in the Era of Climate Change, and it's a collaboration with Harvard Business School and BU Questrom School of Business. We're really excited to have this conversation here tonight. We want to let you know a little bit about City Space. We've been open since the end of February. We did about 22 events last month. We'll do another 20 events this month. We've got a lot lined up. If you like what you see, go to wbur.org/cityspace and check out our lineup. And now I'd like to introduce Mike Toffel from Harvard Business School. Thank you.
So good evening and welcome. So tonight, as was just mentioned, this is part 3 of this Stepping Up program called Stepping Up: Business in the Era of Climate Change. We were highlighting what companies are doing and what they should be doing in this era of climate change. We've already covered the real estate industry, the food and agriculture industry. Tonight, we're talking about climate policy. The next 2 are about transportation and energy. So we're trying to cover all of the major sectors that engage with climate change in this series. So we know that some companies are lobbying hard to preserve the status quo, and we'll hear about some of that tonight. But we'll also hear about companies that are trying to change the status quo, that are trying to implement changes in their own organizations, in organizations that they own, and in public policy. And so that's the scale change that this problem of climate change really requires. And so I'm really excited to have 3 great panelists tonight to talk about these issues. So let me briefly introduce the panelists to you. So Bill Eacho is the co-founder of the Partnership for Responsible Growth, a Washington, D.C. nonprofit dedicated to trying to convince Congress to impose a price on carbon, and then to use the proceeds either as rebates to the population, especially the lower and middle class, or to figure out other ways to make this an appealing political process. He's also served as U.S. ambassador to Austria in the Obama administration, and will bring some perspectives from his time in Europe. And before that, he's been the CEO of an investment firm and of a food service company. He's now a visiting professor at Duke's Policy School, and he's also a Harvard Business School alumnus, I have to mention. Mindy Lubber is here today, also the CEO and president of Ceres, a Boston-based nonprofit that's mobilizing large investors to try and get companies to take stronger action on climate change and sustainability more broadly. She oversees Ceres engagement in large companies to help them enact more sustainable business practices. And she has, before that, managed and founded a green fund and worked at the US EPA as the regional administrator here in New England. Auden Schendler is the senior vice president of sustainability at Aspen Skiing Company. He's an activist within his own company and more broadly, working to green his company's operations and promote the transition to renewable energy. He's on the board of the lobbying group called Protect Our Winter of the outdoor industry. He's written a terrific book called Getting Green Done, which is about how he struggled to try and green Aspen Skiing Company, and writes articles at Harvard Business Review and The Atlantic and elsewhere. He's also the protagonist of a Harvard Business School case study that I wrote and has taught at Harvard and around the world. And he's also involved in local politics, serving as a local councilman for his town of Basalt in Colorado. So we have great speakers lined up. Our moderator tonight is Bruce Gellerman from here at BUR, an award-winning journalist whose beat includes science, business, technology, and the environment. And he's a member of WBUR's Earthwhile team, which focuses on stories about energy and the environment. So with that, without further ado, let me present our moderator and our panelists.
One thing I forgot to mention real quickly, we will take questions this evening. We're going to use a really intuitive, interactive polling app called Slido. So you don't need to download anything. Just go to slido.com and enter the code that you'll see on the screen right there. And you can submit questions throughout the entire conversation, and then we'll take questions at the end. Thank you.
So I'm going to do at least two things wrong tonight, and I'll do the first one right away. This is not the first city space striptease. So you're going to see This is the first public showing of the city space, of WBUR's new vertical, we call it. It's an area of interest that we report on. We have a team of 3 reporters, and we call it Earthwhile, a name that I did not choose. But this is our logo, and this is what it looked like. The second thing that I'm going to do, I'm going to make a mistake, is by doing something which I never liked doing, which is playing audio for a large crowd, because radio is an intimate kind of medium. But we're going to do that just for a second. I want you to listen to this. This is something I recorded. I just condensed it very slightly. It's very short. And it was last week, and it was the launch of the Green New Deal by a local grassroots, now national organization that started in East Boston. So this was the beginning, and Markey was there, and Ayanna Presley was there. It was really extraordinary kind of experience, but just listen to this. So there were about 400 people in Dorchester Strand Theater, mostly young kids.
Now, I'm 25 years old, and that means that we have known about this crisis for twice as long as I have even been alive on this planet. Scientists are giving us 12 years to transform every part of our economy and society to prevent catastrophic damage. That means that for a lot of the members of Sunrise Movement, if we don't take action immediately, their futures will be condemned by the time they're 30.
So that's one of the themes I want to talk about tonight with our panel is age, is the intergenerational nature of the problem that we're here to discuss. I want to show you now something, a video, just this comes from NASA, so you kind of believe it. They're the people that in, 7 years put us on the moon. So this is probably something you've all seen in one way, shape, or form, and it goes from 100 years or so, a little bit more, and it's showing you the intensity of the heating of the planet. So now we're up to 1912. Yellow is kind of normal, baseline. The blue is cold, obviously. Things start heating up at the poles, 1945. You can see the variability by years and decades, right? The climate doesn't work in a direct trajectory. But now we're up to 1970, and things start getting very interesting here. By the way, it's the 49th Earth Day today, started in 1970. So look now, look what happens, right? In a period of 2.5 decades. Yeah. I mean, it's extraordinary. Now you can make the scale anything you want, make it as dramatic as you want, but 3 degrees is a lot, And now we're being told by the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change at the UN, that we've got to stay under 2 degrees centigrade by 2030.
12 years.
12 years. 12 years, or we're going to kind of skid off the road. So I want to do at least, well, I'll save that. This week, the BBC has launched something called David Attenborough. You're all familiar with Sir David Attenborough. And he's got this thing called Climate, the Facts. And it's a polemic. But basically what he says is, and I was trying to get the video, we couldn't download it. It's embedded in the BBC, but you should see it. It's really terrific. Climate is changing more rapidly than we expected. Dramatic action is needed in the next decade, or we'll have irreversible damage, this is a direct quote, to the natural world and the collapse of societies. We're running out of time, but we still have hope. Finally, I want to play something from Greta Thunberg. Nobody heard? Somebody heard of Greta? Okay, so if you haven't, you should see this.
It is the sufferings of the many which pay for the luxuries of the few.
She's 16.
The year 2078, I will celebrate my 75th birthday. If I have children, maybe they will spend that day with me. Maybe they will ask me about you. Maybe they will ask why you didn't do anything while there still was time to act. You say you love your children above all else, and yet you are stealing their future in front of their very eyes. Until you start focusing on what needs to be done, rather than what is politically possible, there is no hope. We cannot solve a crisis without treating it as a crisis. We need to keep the fossil fuels in the ground, and we need to focus on equity. And if solutions within this system are so impossible to find, then maybe we should change the system itself. We have not come here to beg world leaders to care. You have ignored us in the past, and you will ignore us again. We have run out of excuses, and we are running out of time. We have come here to let you know that change is coming, whether you like it or not. The real power belongs to the people. Thank you.
Pretty good. So what she said there, and what I think is a theme through many of the things I just showed you, is that one, we're running out of time, and two, and you can believe that or not, it's not, I won't take it personally. But the thing is where she says, we have to change the system, right? So what system, Mindy, do we need to change? And let me preface that just a little bit. You know, we call this climate business and politics. I would call it climate, maybe free enterprise and capitalism and politics. What do we need to change? Do we have to fundamentally change, or can we get to where we want to be in 2030, 2040, 2050? Can we do that without changing fundamentally the economic underlying system?
Well, let's start with what we need to do. We need to get to well below a 2-degree world and be well on our way in the next 12 years without irreparable harm and possibly an inability to turn things back. So almost inconceivable. Now, the problem is inconceivable, and the damage to our planet and our children's future is inconvenient and inconceivable. So we've got to think about what needs to be done. People will say to us every day, that's too radical, you can't do it. For me, it's more radical to build a future for my kids and your kids and everybody else that can't sustain itself. So what do we got to do? We have, in one way, to To get to where the Paris Agreement says, I would argue, we need to change laws everywhere. I'd like to say we need to change the mentality of business by business by business, investor by investor, and it's changing. And they're different than they were 10 years ago. Many of the companies are moving. Some of them are moving because investors are telling them to move. I mean, we work with 340 global investors whose assets total $30 trillion, who have looked at the 100 largest emitters in the world, and they're pushing them and moving them and cajoling them and shoving them to change. So that's a piece of capitalism. But one by one, one-offs can't get us there quickly enough. So in the end, and we could talk about the changes to capitalism, but short of that, we need to change the policies relating to climate change. We've got a global policy. The United States isn't dealing with it. Federally, we need a price on carbon. It's simple. We know what it is. It's got to be, even the three of us may disagree or agree, I don't know, on what it looks like and what's the price exactly and where do the proceeds go. But you've got to price something that costs society money. Carbon pollution is costing us billions and billions of dollars. It is not an externality that's just sitting out there. It is a real cost to society, and we got to price it. So I think the simplest thing to start with is a federal price on climate. I know who's in the White House, but we need to get there at some point.
And yet, last year was the first time in 8 years that the emissions U.S. emissions have gone up nearly 4%. And that's a result of, well, Auden, you're a businessman, right? It was because the business has been booming, right? We're going in the wrong direction. So what do we need to change? What can we change in the time we've got?
You asking me?
I'm asking you.
When I talk to elected officials, I say, hey, are your constituents talking to you about climate? No. So the question is, hey, we all agree, and Bill's going to talk about carbon tax. We'll talk about carbon tax all night. We need that. We need a bunch of things, a whole bunch of different policies. But what I struggle with is how do you get there? And the climate movement has never reached the scale and size of any of the social movements or revolutions that have done big things throughout history. The positive way to think about that, Bruce, is that we humans know how to do revolution. We've done it before. We did it in France. We did it in the United States. We did it on labor. We did it on women's voting. We did it on civil rights. We're still working on that. And we've had other types of big changes that happen rapidly, gay marriage, marijuana law. But my question is, well, how do you get that movement developed? And without going into too much detail, I come from the outdoor industry. Well, let's just compare the outdoor industry to the gun lobby. The gun lobby, NRA, has about 5.5 million members. 2 million of those are really active. The outdoor industry, REI alone, the outdoor retailer, has 17 million members. And you think gun owners are fanatical and maybe a little crazy. Well, the outdoor industry is full of absolute whack jobs who are super motivated. They're young, they're healthy, they're used to doing really hard things, and they're incredibly passionate. If you East Coast skiers know what I'm talking about. You go out in the rain, ski on ice. I can't even ski that. So we've been saying, how do you use the outdoor industry to seed the revolution? It's not going to be enough, but it's a start. And right now, we just don't have the political will to get to the kinds of policies we want. So I think that's where I'm currently pushing.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting you use the word revolution, because I heard that from the bank, the governors of the Bank of France and England last week wrote an op-ed piece in which they called for an energy revolution. Right? There couldn't be more conservative people, business people in the world, right? So, Ambassador, where do you come from on this? Revolution, youth?
Well, there's no question we need more political engagement around the issue, because we have to change our political leadership in Washington, ultimately, at least in the Senate and in the White House, before we're going to see a serious attention on this issue. But we also have to change the way we talk about it. I think, and the Green New Deal aspirationally is 100% going in the right direction. But it has created a bit of an opening in that if we can persuade the other side that we need to take action on this, we can come together on a bipartisan solution. You can start by saying, instead of saying we're going to tax carbon, for example, which is what we really need to do, we want to start by saying we're going to remove the massive subsidy on fossil fuels. And then Republicans say, wait a minute, really? Do we subsidize fossil fuels? And you say, yeah, because they're not paying for their external costs. So that's a subsidy. Let's remove that subsidy and create a level playing field for renewables. Once you do that, renewables become far more competitive, right? So let's harness capitalism. Let's harness the free enterprise system and put it to work. And that's why we need to price carbon. Right now, we're giving away that right to pollute the atmosphere to whoever wants to take it, right? We have the tragedy of the commons. But let's put a price on it, and behavior will change. Consumer behavior will change. Industrial behavior will change. We will shift to low-carbon energy resources. We'll shift to non-carbon energy sources. And the transition that we need to see happen in the next 12 years could happen very quickly. Just depends on how significant a price you're willing to put on it day one.
I want to talk about carbon prices a lot, a lot. I want to spin off something that you said, though, that, is that enough? Businesses, you're a businessman, you run a business, you deal with business people all the time. Don't they get it? I mean, don't they get it, right? Efficiency is money in your pocket. And it's the cheapest form of gaining profit, is make yourself more efficient. Doesn't every capitalist get it? Why not?
So our capitalist system was designed and built on a religious motto almost, and that is short term, short term, short term. And investors, businesses, they value themselves, they're rewarded by their board, their compensation is tied to how they're doing over the next 3 months or how did they do over the last 3 months. Addressing climate change and other sustainability metrics, water, climate, things that allow us to build a future, investments in that don't necessarily show up over 3 months. They show up, they're smart, they make a difference, and they're real. The other thing is somehow trade risk, currency risk, inflation risk were all financial risks that businesses, investors, that fiduciaries, board members of businesses have to look at. And they put climate change, water shortages, our inability to create enough food to feed 8 billion people as some other risk, an environmental or good guy or social risk. And that is nonsense. These are financial risks, of course, as well as humanity risks that we need to, we must, and we've got to act on. But they are financial risks, and they have not been factored into financial models to date. We're starting to see some of it. There are companies who've stepped into the breach while this administration takes us backwards, but not nearly enough. And too many companies, including many that we work with, are trying to do good, bring their footprint down, increase to 80% renewables. But in the end, they're still stopping policy. They're not there. We've got to get to a scale and a scope that is quite different than anything we've seen. And frankly, it will be inconvenient. It will be radical. It is not easy. But as I said, it's far more radical to let our kids wither. What we're saying, and let there be no mistake, by 2050, we need no fossil fuels. That's what it takes to get to a below 2-degree world as dictated by the Paris Agreement. And it is radical, but it is doable. It can be done. And capital markets have to be part of that transition.
What's interesting is it's not happening on the federal level, right? We excused ourselves from Paris Accords. It's happening on the municipal, town, city levels. They're the ones, New York City, Boston, right? Washington, Seattle, they're setting very high, very stringent trajectories. And the question is, can they get there? I mean,
They can get there, but it's not going to solve the problem. I mean, it's a piece of the solution, right? But we really need to do it at the federal level because we need to make it go global. Ultimately, we need a global, uniform, significant price on carbon emissions. And then behavior will change globally.
Mm-hmm. But if we put a price on carbon, I mean, I was looking at David Leonhardt, who writes for the New York Times, and he had a statistic that just blew me out of off the seat, actually, because I didn't hear this before. And he said, amazingly, these are his words, the wealth of the median American household has fallen 30% since 2007. 30%. Now, I didn't prove that, but I'll take his word. He's an excellent economist. So how can we ask people, at least in the United States, to pay more for fuel relative to the amount of income they have? I mean, is it no wonder they turn around and say, well, forget you?
Well, that's why you have to rebate the proceeds, or at least the lion's share of the proceeds. If you pay
You're talking
back,
about a carbon tax.
if you apply a carbon fee, you're going to collect revenue. If you take that revenue and rebate it, low and middle income households actually come out ahead. If you rebate even 70% of it,
so let's talk about
across the board.
So how would a carbon tax, in your imagination, work? Because there's many flavors of carbon tax. Right. What's your flavor?
Well, as an organization, we don't espouse. We're agnostic about how you use the revenue. Our role is to educate policymakers. But we point out that if you want it to stay in place, you need to rebate a substantial portion of the revenues so that the average family is receiving more in their rebate than they're paying in higher energy costs.
So, something for nothing?
In effect, for them, because it's like, and they're never going to want to give it up if you do that, because it's like the Alaska dividend. Who wants to give it up? You're getting that rebate check. However, wealthier families, yes, they're going to pay more. People who live in large homes, who fly around in their corporate jets, who drive big SUVs, probably going to pay a little bit more, but they might have a reason now to buy a more energy efficient vehicle, right? So their behavior will change. And they'll still collect their rebate, but they'll be the guy that says, I put solar cells on my roof, and I'm not paying for that stuff anymore. I'm not paying in. And then over time, eventually, that revenue will drop because we will go fossil free, right? So, but there's a transition period during which you're going to receive more back than you're paying in, and then we're there.
I think it's a mistake to focus too much on this particular policy answer. First, it's going to be part of a silver buckshot solution. And there's a New York Times piece you probably saw that said, carbon tax is increasingly politically unviable because it's a tax or it's a fee, and people don't want that, and they're hurting. And so what's been successful at the state level has been renewable energy standards. And what you're selling is, do you like clean energy? Yes. Would you like more of it? Yes. Vote for it. This is happening throughout the country. Colorado is now well on its way. And in some ways, we're going to solve electricity before we solve other things. But you asked, I think, an important question. Don't they get it? And you were getting at efficiency. Hey, if we operate more efficiently as a business, if we change light bulbs, if we build green buildings and all that, doesn't that make sense? The answer is yes, they get it. They're longer term solutions than just a few months. They're doing that, and it stops there. So instead of, so they'll cut if you're a corporation and you cut your carbon footprint 20%, you're like God in the efficiency world. If DuPont cut its carbon footprint that much, it's huge.
But that's why we need to price carbon. Because you're only going to get so far without a price.
But I'm going to focus tonight on how do you get to that price. So they cut it. It doesn't do anything on carbon because not everyone is doing it. Anyway, they had to go 80% reduction, not 20, maybe 100%. So what I've been saying is, how do you get there? Well, the corporate voice on this is mostly absent. The work Mindy's doing is bringing that to the fore, but what's happening is that voice is behind closed doors. Hey, let's talk about trade policy, let's talk about this, let's talk about that. By the way, we care about climate change. And more of that is happening, but no CEOs in the Fortune 500 world are getting up in the New York Times and saying, climate's a major issue, we need to act on it.
So let me say a few things in response to Bruce and then in response to Auden. It is true that we've got to wean ourselves off of fossil fuels. I mean, fossil fuels are the largest part of the problem. But we ought to at least note in this dark conversation about how complicated it is, not easy to get there, that solar and wind are now competitive. Nobody thought they were going to be 10 years ago. For every 5 new jobs in the United States in the energy field, 4 out of 5 are renewables. We are seeing progress. States are passing, as Auden said, and we've run business enterprise lobby days and activism around the country in 17 states supporting a renewable portfolio standard, how to move states to make commitments to 20, 25, 30% renewable energy by a given date. So progress is being made. We're also seeing political candidates, and this is why you need to keep building the political will. But in 2016, we could not get climate on the presidential agenda. It is on the agenda now, and it will be on the agenda. Almost every candidate is opining on it. Most of them in good ways. Clearly, the guy in the White House, not so much. People who ran for office in the most recent elections were elected with climate being a strong part of their platform. So we are making progress. There's good news to see. Not enough, not at the pace, not at the scale. So in the end, we do have to build the political base of what it means. And I am completely heartened and inspired, whether it's Greta, where there are now millions of young people across Europe not going to school on Fridays because they care about climate change. That will spread here. They will want it. Companies right now are having to listen to employees who want them to be better corporate citizens. They're all recruiting for the best and the brightest and competing with each other. If they want the best and the brightest, they're going to have to lead on sustainability. And we haven't seen yet consumers. But that's the next place we have to go. It's probably not where we're most suited at Ceres to organize a base. But consumers need to show up, and when they do, they are heard. Not only students, but consumers, and say, I'm buying from company X because they've got a good policy and program, and I'm not buying from company Y. And the more we see the growth of the energy within political campaigns, the extraordinary increase of energy by the youth, the more we could bring consumers into the debate, the more we could at least focus on companies speak their language. Look, they want more customers. Okay, let's make sure their customers are telling them what they want them to be and what they want them to look like.
And yet the yellow vests in Paris are people who don't want to pay those high prices for fuel. It was a fuel tax that ignited this.
That's because in Paris, nobody proposed to rebate the proceeds to them or to use it to lower their economic burden. The beauty of a carbon tax with a rebate coming back is it is actually, more progressive than the system we have today. And it puts more money in the pockets of low and middle income households. Now, the right will say, wait a minute, that's redistribution, so we don't like that. There's already one right-wing economist who's already said, I don't like this 100% dividend because of the, because it's redistribution.
Right.
But it's really not. It's really giving the money back to the people it belongs to begin with. Because think about it. Do I own more of the atmosphere or the right to pollute the atmosphere because I'm rich? No. We should all own equally the right to pollute the atmosphere. Therefore, we should all share equally in the revenue that when we're selling off that resource that we collect, right?
So if I want to get on a plane and go to Buenos Aires, I have to pay.
You're going to pay the fee.
I'm going to pay the fee. And it'll come back to me at the end of the year.
You're going to get your quarterly rebate or however we structure it, right? You're going to receive it as a tax cut or receive it in your bank account. But the beauty of that is you can then decide, I'm getting this money back regardless of my energy expenditure. So now I could take some of that money and maybe put solar cells on my roof. Or maybe I'll buy a more energy efficient car. Behavior will change with a price signal.
Mm-hmm. And
that's how you transform economies.
And then one of the questions is, of course, what's the signal? How big a price? How do we price it?
I think it needs to be as high as we can sustain, as high as we can stomach, and then go higher every year.
So the hidden hand of capitalism.
It works. It works.
So let me show you how it doesn't. Let me show you how it doesn't, right? You talked about solar and wind being competitive. The reason they're competitive is because states have set standards. We have RGGI here, right? Regional greenhouse gas.
Yeah.
And we have to, I'm not sure what they have in Colorado. You have some kind of notching up where that regionally you have to reduce.
No, it's federal, but.
Yeah, so, excuse me, so we don't So the way RGGI works is basically every year the utilities have to get a greater amount of their energy from renewable resources, and we have to pay more. But they've set standards, right? And the governor here has set standards. And let's say there's a pie, and it used to be deregulated. We had a deregulated industry. We're re-regulating it by having these cutouts or these mandates. That's not capitalism.
Capitalism works when there is honest pricing, when you price things that have a cost. Pollution from climate is a cost to society. It's not invisible. It's not an externality. It is an honest pricing signal. And so you could call it anything you want, regulation, non-regulation. I would argue that capitalism only works to the extent it works, and there are some certain legitimate concerns that we could all voice. But if we're working within a capitalistic system, it can't work with dishonest pricing signals.
Mm-hmm. I got to point out, you had, you mentioned it's not really capitalism, you're subsidizing these things and so forth. In the audience, we've got the world expert on subsidies of the fossil fuel industry. Doug, will you just raise your hand so people can come to you later? So that's a great resource. But one of the challenges I have is, again, I'm a carbon tax guy. I love it. But I worry that you're going to have a hard time passing it at a high enough level to be meaningful in the modern world. Now, if you do dividend it back and people understand it, you could. But I'm concerned that you might not be able to get the, if you could win, get too low a carbon tax, it doesn't escalate, and then you didn't win.
That's true. If we go out too low, it isn't going to work. And that's the problem right now with the cap and trade system.
And if you go too high,
they've
you don't
all
win.
gone too low. RGGI is $5 or $6 a ton. That's not changing behavior enough. In California, they're at $15 a ton. That's not changing behavior enough. In Europe, they're at 25. That's not changing behavior enough, right? We saw in British Columbia, where they put in a $15 Canadian tax and ramped it up to $30, they had, that province, British Columbia, had during that time period the biggest emissions drop of any province in Canada and the fastest revenue growth, fastest GDP growth, economic growth. So they had a win-win answer. But then it leveled off. Why? Because they didn't continue to ramp up the price. Right?
Aren't we putting the cart before the horse a little bit in that it's going to be hard to get this through? So shouldn't we be talking about
how we do that?
How do we get the political will?
Well, let me just add to that. In New York City, right, they just passed, every building has got to hit a carbon emissions, and they're tough. Right? I mean, that's a mandate. That's got teeth in it. So, that's not a...
So there's no question you could accomplish a lot of these objectives with mandates, with standards, et cetera, a regulatory approach. You're going to have a hard time agreeing at a federal level on a bipartisan answer that approaches it from a regulatory approach.
Politics.
It's just not going to happen. You have a far better chance at a bipartisan solution if you're talking about market solutions. And we ought to look at what's happening right now. The Green New Deal has created an opening, a space for Republicans to now say, I'm not disputing the science. Now they're saying, 10 years ago they were saying, I don't know about the science, right? And then a few years ago it was like, I'm not a scientist. But now it's, oh no, climate change is real, but I'm opposed to the Green New Deal. We need a market solution. Hey, that's progress. If we can get Republicans more and more to say, we need a market solution, well, guess what? The market solution is to price carbon. Right?
But there's never any one thing that's going to make the difference. So there'll be all kinds of policy things that have to happen. I agree we've got to make the case that we need that policy because it won't come easily. The fossil fuel industry has run roughshod over Congress for as long as I could remember. And they're not going to say, oh, yeah, we need to not exist in the year 2050, which is what the reality is. But there are other forces. So we need to see the youth. We need consumers. We need to be organizing political campaigns. And we need to be doing that now. We've got some big political campaigns coming up. I mean, capitalism, though, whether we like it or not, it is the system we're in. What we are starting to see is companies and investors starting to act on climate because it costs a bundle. Not only is it the most outrageous thing to be imposing it on children, but we cannot sustain a planet with the kind of emissions that we're having. And we're seeing those changes every day. For insurance companies to be paying out hundreds of billions, not millions of dollars, due to the Houston flooding, due to Puerto Rico, due to the storms in the Keys, that's starting to at least get on the radar, why it had to take this long when insurance companies are in many ways the arbiters of financial risk with all their actuaries. But they're starting to see it. I mean, PG&E, Pacific Gas and Electric, one of the more progressive electric utility companies in California, because of the forest fires and the climatic changes that made those fires more serious, forced PG&E into bankruptcy. $18 billion company, $32 billion in liabilities. What does it mean? It means we're losing all sorts of renewable energy contracts. It means that insurance companies that insured that utility are going out of business. The bankruptcies from one particular act. Every day we're seeing more of that. What the government office told us in December of this past year was that we will lose 10% off the top of our economy if we don't act on climate change. Other economists are saying this is substantially worse than the subprime meltdown when we play out the implications for business. Now, it may take too long, but some of that will drive business into the debate in a more proactive way. We just need to hasten that.
Mindy, let me ask that question. So I think that's all happening. Do you envision that corporate leaders like Apple, Facebook, Ford, GM, Pepsi, Coke, Microsoft, Google, will go from just doing this operational stuff that really doesn't move the needle but lets them say they have a climate plan, and go from that to legitimate action, meaning Tim Cook, public statement, Wall Street Journal op-ed on climate, all these voices in Washington, which you're bringing those voices, but they still haven't become public national voices. In the 2016 election, so Facebook, Amazon, Microsoft, and Google are all doing phenomenal things with major clean power purchases. And in the 2016 election, they gave more money to Republicans than Democrats. So while they're powering themselves with green power, they're also putting in the infrastructure of the end of civilization. So I'm wondering, you're so close to this, are we going to see that? When? Right. And if not, why not?
And right. Should companies be required to put in their 10Ks or their reports, right, that the threats that climate change pose to them, so they tell their investors?
So we wrote with 60 of our investor members the guidance that the SEC adopted in 2011 requiring the disclosure of climate risk. Given this administration, it's not being used, it's not being forced about. So yes, that's the bare minimum. I want to come back to what you asked because it's the right question. Yes, companies need to dig in and say, what is my risk? If you're an agricultural company and half of the farms that supply your food and ag that you're selling are not able to produce that because of climate, that's a problem. If you're an insurance company, there's almost no sector that isn't profoundly negatively impacted by climate change. It might not be over the next 24 hours, but it will be happening over the next couple of years. We almost need that to be worse. I'm not calling for it to be worse. So companies could see that and be pushed to act. But you asked the right question. How far can we push companies and how far will they go? I think there are some leadership companies, Apple committing to not only 100% renewables. And let me say, I'm not an apologist for any of these companies. Most of them are, even those that are moving, have a certain duplicity in that they may commit to 100% renewables, they may commit to science-based targets, they may commit to a carbon tax, and they're still supporting the Chamber of Commerce, which is opposing a carbon tax and everything else. And so we are starting to push companies much harder to be consistent.
Apple's not, just
yes,
at least
Apple's
on that
not
point.
Consistent?
No, it's not
exactly.
Chamber
So
of Commerce.
Apple is an example, though, beyond that. They did pull out of the Chamber of Commerce. They also, when we were working with the Senate president in California on SB 100, which is a bill that basically says California is going to go be carbon neutral by 2045. Apple was one amongst 10 or 15 companies that were with us every single day in Sacramento. So they do exist. The problem is there's way too few. And the problem is for every company that is doing something good, they somehow are still justifying their engagement and involvement in a trade association based on, wait, but I stay in the chamber because they're good on trade or they're good for me on tax.
Right.
They're tough issues, but I think we have to push harder, and the numbers are too few of real leaders. I think if it's just standing up on a price on carbon or on a renewable portfolio standard in the state, more and more companies will stand up and say it loud and publicly, but it doesn't mean they're doing everything else.
We see ski resorts that, do you get climate change? Yeah. Is it going to put your whole industry out of business? Yeah. Well, here's a bill. It might increase utility rates 2%. I don't think we can do that. You know, it's incredibly short-sighted. It's the future of the industry. 2%. We'll take the 2%.
Right. And we feel it here, actually, in New England.
Oh, yeah.
We're getting killed. So I want to show you a picture from your resort, okay? Can we put up that slide? So you did something which I found very curious. I've never seen anything like this. It looks like Rube Goldberg on acid or something. What is this?
Okay, well, I'll just show you what's going on. So this is actually a collection system that purifies natural gas, methane, leaking from a coal mine. This is taking the water out and purifying it. And then the rest of my system isn't here, so I need that picture. But it goes into, this is methane leaking from a coal mine that then goes into 3 truck engines and makes electricity. So the methane was going to vent to atmosphere. This is
whether you captured it or not.
Coal mines leak methane. And this project, it's the only one of its kind in the United States. It makes 3 megawatts of baseload power, which is enough to power 4 ski mountains, 18 restaurants, 3 hotels. It's a huge amount of power. It deletes 3 times the carbon impact because when you destroy methane and turn it to CO2, you're preventing a very potent greenhouse gas. Now, the interesting part of this project is it's a partnership with a coal mine, which is sort of your enemy if you care about climate. It's a climate project. Who owns the coal mine? Bill Koch, K-O-C-H. Can you believe that?
I didn't know that.
Am I blowing your mind now?
Whose money bought that?
My money, our money, Aspen Skiing Company.
Mm-hmm. How much it cost?
$6 million.
How much have you made it back?
When we did it, after we did it, the mine exploded, which is characteristic of gassy mines. Anyway, that was delayed our payback. We're about 2/3 of the way to being paid back, and then we'll make money. It'll pay like a 12% bond.
But the point here is this is fabulous ideas, technology. In the United States, this is what we do well. We innovate. We are a dynamic economy, right? Once we start applying free market principles to the climate change issue by pricing carbon in some form or fashion, there are going to be all kinds of new ideas. And it's not just pricing carbon. We're going to have other policies as well, right? Because there are going to be things that carbon price doesn't get to.
Let me give an example, Bill, of why. So behind this, just in the corner, you can see it looks like a giant stack. And that's a flare. That's just burning off the methane because there's extra. Now, flaring methane is also environmentally beneficial because you're preventing methane,
right.
CO2 potency 84 or 100, and instead it's CO2. The reason we can do that, our partner does that, is he sells carbon credits into the cap and trade market in California. So they're paying him to flare it. This is an example of regulation, like what Bill's describing, that creates innovation. Now, if you weren't able to sell it into California, all that methane would just go to atmosphere.
Or if you're pricing carbon, then we're saying, no, wait a minute, you're going to pay a bigger tax on that methane going into the atmosphere. Right. So you're going to say, wait a minute, then I'm going to go and invest in turning it into CO2. Maybe I'm going to invest in eliminating it altogether.
Right.
I mean, there are technologies today for taking trash, municipal waste, and turning it into energy. Why are we not seeing it everywhere? Just because people aren't aware, because you need the price signal, you need the financial motivation.
And you need to have the place to put all the ash. I mean, we've got 7 trash to energy incinerators in Massachusetts.
You don't necessarily create ash, some of the newer technologies. You actually turn it into a liquid fuel.
You're right. Actually, they produce, our 7 plants from trash to energy produce more renewable energy, if you consider trash renewable, and we seem to have an endless supply, more right now than solar and wind together in the Massachusetts. So it's at a...
But I think we really hit the nail on the head when we talked about where we need business CEOs. In Washington, I mean, oil and gas company CEOs, the big oil and gas companies will all tell you, oh yeah, we favor a carbon tax that's 100% rebatable. And by the way, the version that they favor also absolves them of any liability for climate-related lawsuits, and we agree to eliminate all regulations, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Now, eliminating regulations that are duplicated by a carbon tax, fine. But there are a lot that aren't. They're addressing other issues, right? So there's a certain amount of self-service in that position. I think it's a step forward because at least they can say, yeah, we support putting a price on carbon, right? But are they telling their petrochemical industry lobbyist or the American Petroleum Association lobbyist to say the same thing when they walk in to Capitol Hill? Not necessarily. When you ask people on Capitol Hill, so you're aware that ExxonMobil's in favor of pricing carbon. Have they come in and asked you to enact legislation? No, I haven't heard that from them. I hear other things from them, right?
Well, and ExxonMobil in particular, but most of the oil and gas industry, yes, they say they're in favor of a price on carbon. That could be such a negligible price that it is de minimis and not useful.
Right.
On top of that, any effort which they are making every day to take away our ability to sue, liability provisions, which is a crucial part of their narrative, needs to be off the table. It is a long-held legal
that's
tradition
a decidedly
of our Justice
non-market
Department,
solution.
And taking away liability for people who have the right and the necessity to sue ought to be dismissed out of hand by any policymaker. We don't know that it will be. But oil and gas companies have yet to really be genuine beyond I'll support a price on carbon.
Even the devil can quote scripture.
That's right.
Maybe we should be paying them to keep their fossil fuels in the ground.
Well, absolutely. I mean, I would rather do that than have them burned. I'd rather them pay for it out of their dividends and profits.
Because there's social benefits which we don't readily see in these kind of storage. That is, like trees store carbon, right? We wouldn't want cut down in the Amazon or any place else because so they have a value, and they have a value as being a part of a forest and an ecosystem. You support something like that? Is that something we should be doing besides just carbon pricing our use of carbon, but the storage of carbon? Should we pay Exxon for not taking it out of the ground?
I don't think I would do that, but I would certainly pay the farmers in the Amazon to not cut down those trees. I'd certainly pay them for that, the fact that there's a sink there, a carbon sink, and we need that, right? And there are programs today to do that.
And pricing those is difficult, of course, because... So how do you go ahead.
Well, you're getting at this, there's a lot of talk now of how you capture carbon out of the atmosphere, because the sentiment is you're going to need to burn a lot of this stuff to keep society running, then you got to pull it out. And that's hugely expensive. And to your point, if you've ever, seen a chunk of coal, it's this dense carbon, and what would it cost to capture it from the air? $200 a ton. What would it keep to pay Exxon or someone to keep it in the ground? $20 a ton, 40, whatever the number is.
Everybody's got their price.
It's cheaper. So you're sort of getting at, down the line, there is going to be this, what's the cheapest way to keep it in the ground? Or to get it out of the air. It's not going to be to capture it out of the atmosphere.
And make money at doing it, though. That's the key here, right? How does a capitalist... Because I was looking at China, which is by far now the largest emitter. I'm pretty sure of that, right?
They are.
Surpassing the United States. So they've got this... command society, they have capitalism, but they can also dictate where the nukes are going to go and energy efficiencies. And where do they play in this? Forget capitalism. What about whatever they are?
Well, they're actually experimenting with a cap and trade system that they're planning on implementing by 2020, I think it is. Now, they are talking about a very modest price, but they recognize that there's an issue and they have to address it. And interestingly, in their case, they have to worry, one of the biggest issues that Chinese officials worry about every day. They want to stay in power. So one of the ways you stay in power is don't make people live in a city that is so polluted they have to wear a mask everywhere and they can't see, right?
I've been there.
So they recognize they have to get off coal. They're not doing it as quickly as I might like, but they recognize they have to move in that direction. So they're subsidizing electric vehicles. They've got a much bigger electric vehicle market than we have. They're now allowing American manufacturers to come in and build electric vehicles there without a joint venture partner like they used to require. So they're going to move in this direction. But if we were to take the step of pricing carbon, they would match us. Indeed, years ago, I got into this business because I was trying to sell our climate policy overseas, and that was a struggle. And I came back and talked to our chief negotiator, Todd Stern, and said, why don't we just propose pricing carbon? It would make so much sense. The global price on carbon, And he said, Bill, I could sell that to the Chinese tomorrow. And they'd laugh in my face and say, how are you going to convince those Republicans in Congress, right? They recognize the way our politics work. So when we started the partnership, the idea was we have to build a bipartisan answer here. We have to be able to market to both sides of the aisle and develop a bipartisan answer that both sides can live with and educate them, right? And I still think that has to be the answer. Whatever the solution is politically, it has to be bipartisan, or the next time around, the other guys win the election and undo it, as we've seen them do with the Affordable Care Act, right? So it has to be bipartisan, which means, on my mind, it has to be a market solution. Because that's what's bipartisan. That's what's going to attract the attention.
So we can take your questions. So this is Slido, and there's the information if you want to send this off a question. No question that we've got this societal problem, and as the solution, though, it has to be societal and social. It seems to be that the solution is electricity, that we're electrifying our society, right? We'd want to make fossil fuel-free electricity and use it. But how do we get there when we have to build grid and power transmitters and all of those kind of infrastructure things? How do we convince people politically that you really, because we have the problem in Maine, right? We want all this clean hydropower from Quebec. They got plenty of it. We want it. The only problem is Maine is in the way. Right? How do we convince them? Or does Maine have its price? Or does the forest have its price?
Well, everything does have its price. I want to talk about infrastructure in a bigger way, and we can come back to that. The United States government, over the next 2 years to 4 years, is going to spend trillions, not billions, not hundreds of billions, but several $1 trillion on infrastructure. That infrastructure is about roads, it's about highways, it's about bridges, it's about airports, it's about schools, it's about pipelines. And we have a choice right now in this day, and you could call it regulation or not, free market or not. Frankly, I'm not as much of a free market. I haven't seen that work that well. But we need to set standards for how that infrastructure money is spent. When $2 or $3 trillion, and some say it's up to $10 trillion, is spent over the next 4 years, it could lock us in to unlimited more emissions, building highways that we don't need, building highways with the worst cement, the worst steel.
And a highway itself is a subsidy of fossil fuel.
And a highway itself, as I said, which we may or may not need. We have got to look at those big opportunities. I mean, we certainly could take on pipeline decision by pipeline, state by state by state, but that money is going to flow. It's going to flow with or without us. And if we are not ready and organized with a standard by which that infrastructure money has to be spent, it could exacerbate the problem rather than help remedy the problem. And it is something that we need to focus on like a laser.
So it comes down to but politics and economics. I mean, what utility is going to want to subsidize solar energy in my house if it cuts into their profits or their business model? I mean,
well, not necessarily. It may prevent them from having to spend a lot of money on a new generating facility, right?
But this is happening in Colorado. So the utility that is that feeds us has been investing in efficiency and in rooftop solar. And last year, their revenue went down 6%. So the CEO said, and he was brand new, he said, hey, I just looked at the data. If this keeps going on, I'm out of business pretty quick.
Right.
So, but here's a fix, and this kind of gets to your answer. So one, on infrastructure, these are jobs. You know, and in Colorado, we're losing coal mines and coal miners, and you need to replace it with something. Well, Trump likes infrastructure. Let's do some grid infrastructure where you put these people who can do that work to work. So that's one piece of it. And then here's the other piece. And this isn't talked about a lot. To solve climate, yes, you have to electrify the grid. You have to decarbonize the grid. But then you have to shift all building heat from burning fossil fuels to electricity. Well, that's a way for a utility to sell more power. So the utility can stay alive if you structure rates so that, you know, this building can buy electricity at a comparable rate that it would cost to heat with gas. And so you can keep the utilities alive. You can create jobs with infrastructure. There's a pretty neat fix in there.
If you put a high enough price on carbon, we'll all be driving electric vehicles. That creates more demand for electricity. So the utility will find more customers, right?
So how do we find that price? What's the price for a ton of carbon? How do we find it? We got to set a price.
So last week or week before last, Senator Schatz in the White House introduced a bill starting at $52, going up at 6% a year over inflation. So eventually it ratchets up pretty quickly to $100 a ton, even higher.
And we know it's coming, it's predictable.
And you know it's coming, so therefore you can invest based on that, make assumptions. This is one of the problems with cap and trade. You don't really know where the price is going, it fluctuates, and in general it's been too low with every cap and trade system so far. That's been the problem. You're leaving too much on the table. So you can make an investment. Now, I'm sure that they probably started in what their mind is high, with the idea that we're going to have to negotiate. Other proposals are at $40 a ton. The politics have shifted on this. We used to be talking $15, $25 a ton. Mm-hmm. Now all the discussion is around $40 to $50 a ton.
So what's the math on that, Bill? If there's a $50 tax, what is your gas cost? Just to
it's about 47 cents
per for the 50
gallon. Yeah.
And
it's going to go up.
Prices go up like that in a matter of months.
We've paid more than that when oil prices were higher, right? Much more.
A lot of.
Mm-hmm.
You get it up around $100 a ton, then it's maybe closer to $1 a gallon, and that's when behavior will start to change, right? So that the average consumer starts to think, you know, that $35,000 electric vehicle sounds like a better deal today. So over time, that will drive more people, and there's no question at the same time, we also have to invest in the grid and distributed grid, all these new technologies. One of the reasons we don't take a position on what to do with the revenue is ultimately we think the sweet spot in Washington is going to be using some of that revenue for infrastructure, because both sides of the aisle believe we need to spend money on infrastructure. They both recognize we're completely underinvested. And so take a portion of the money and set it aside for that.
So here's a challenge. You're going to put a $50 price, and again, that's the right number. That's high.
I think it's on the low side, but
yeah, but it's high compared to what people have talked about. But you're going to try to pass a $50 tax on carbon that doesn't go back to the people. And
I think you have to.
And Gore, Clinton Gore tried to do 4-cent BTU tax, right, mm-hmm. and couldn't do it. So again, I'm in support of this, but I think the price is limited not by what's the right price, but by the politics of it,
and that's why
how much gets dividended.
One of the other proposals, one of the other bills that we've seen in the House, is a $15 per ton, which I would argue is too low, but it goes up at $10 a year.
Did you guys sign up for this Nerd Fest? Nerd Fest?
Exactly. That one actually gets up to a pretty high price pretty quickly, too. It's really, where are you going to be in 5 or 6 years?
So the question here is, a lot of discussion is what is politically possible implies compromise. Climate doesn't compromise and markets aren't efficient, which is kind of an interesting statement. Local business role, question mark. What's the local business role? First of all, are markets aren't efficient or are markets efficient? Because this is a market-based approach.
Markets can be efficient if there are the right pricing signals. So they're not efficient when it's the Wild West. Do what you want. If you price things honestly, then markets can be efficient. And I think markets Capital markets have to be a very big part of this. We need the largest businesses acting on climate. Now, we need to talk about how to make sure that happens. Part of it will be their employees. Some part of it will be their customers. They've got to move. Part of it will be just fear of the risk to their businesses. The same thing with investors. But you need the right market signals or things are distorted.
I'm amazed because some big companies make awful decisions, market decisions. I mean, really awful. Take the companies that are making the nuke power plants in Georgia, Vogtle, right? They were projected to cost something like $13 billion for 2 reactors. They're built. They can't finish them because they're actually twice as expensive. How did they get it so wrong? And what would a pricing structure do to make? Because we need that clean energy, right? What would your idea of a carbon tax, would that make nuclear power more?
Yeah, actually, the nuclear industry tells you that at $25 a ton, they'll be competitive again. They're still not going to be competitive with natural gas. At $75 a ton, they're competitive with natural gas. And you start to see a shift away from natural gas back to nuclear.
At the same time, we've got to remove 40 years of fossil fuel subsidies that have been there, have propped up the industry, have allowed the industry to dominate and become the monopolistic industry. So if we're talking about changing of capital market signals, you need to put the subsidies where they need to go that are built around things like building a future, and you need to take away the subsidies that have been in existence.
But you're talking about blowing up a system that we've had for all these many years.
You know, blowing up a system that we've had for all these years is better than blowing up the world. And literally, I mean, we should come back to, and I agree, because we're not going to decide the price on carbon tonight. There's going to be years of negotiations until this administration changes. We're probably not even going to have.
We're going to try to get it done tonight, though.
Seriously, but we know that to get that, and to get the changes in policy at a state level, at a federal level, to get to that below 2 degrees within 12 years, to be well on our way, or we might see an irrevocable progress where we're unable to turn the clocks back of the kind of emissions we're seeing. We're going to have to make some radical decisions.
But this isn't blowing it up. It's just fixing it. Subsidies are dumb. Price on carbon is an unpriced externality. Where you're trying to create real capitalism.
So this is a really good question. I like this one. Because part of the Green New Movement is a social justice movement, right? It's incorporated, it's part and parcel there. And social equality, economic equality is built into that cake, right? How do we take into account developing economies that depend on fossil fuels as a means of commerce and manufacturing, and a switch would be virtually impossible? So, we're in some...
So you're operating under the assumption that coal is still a cheaper resource just because it looks cheaper today to India, for example, to burn coal, right? But once you price carbon, once you are paying for the external costs, which Indians have to absorb as well, indeed, they may get hit a lot harder than we get hit, right? Then no, it's no longer cheaper.
Even without pricing it, it's cheaper.
We're getting there, right? They're starting to invest in solar, et cetera. But an honest price on carbon, now we can argue about what that is. Anywhere from $50 to $200 is the range I've seen. I think the Stanford study put it at over $200. I don't see the politics behind that. But just getting something started changes behavior. And once you start to do that, oh my gosh, the economics of every decision you make change radically.
Do we need a transfer of wealth? I mean, in the United Nations, IPCC, what they want to do is raise $100 billion a year. That was part of the Paris Accord. They've not raised chicken scratch, I would guess. I don't know the exact number, but I'm sure it's nowhere near that. So the idea was to transfer wealth from wealthier countries which have benefited from the burning of fossil fuel, cheap fossil fuels, and sending the money there so we can repair their economies. Politics, economics, global trade, I mean, how do we fix that?
Well, certainly those multilaterals, the World Bank and others, need to be in the right place rather than the wrong place. And they're still adjusting their policies to where they're putting their money, where they're bankers in Africa, where they're bankers in other places.
They need to stop financing coal plants.
What's that?
Right? Stop financing coal plants.
Right. And their bets have been in the wrong place.
Well, they finance dams, too. I mean, there's a societal cost of building a dam.
So, but let's look at some of those numbers. In the United States, and this doesn't answer the developing world problem, in the United States, we've seen $900 billion, close to $1 trillion from the private sector being committed to renewable energy over the next 5 years, from Citi, Wells Fargo, B of A, JP Morgan, Morgan Stanley. And I'm not tooting their horns. Those very same banks are still banking coal and tar sands. But they are putting money into the renewable energy future, not because they're environmental activists, because they're smart bets and they're making money off of that. Now, the percentage of that that's going into the developing world, and the goal has been about 5 to 7% of some of these big companies, they're still struggling to find the right investments to make. So we've got to make sure that the right investments are there. I think they're starting to flow, but it's definitely too slow.
So the fuse has been lit. We're told we have 12 years in order to, 13 years, 11 years, 40 years, pick your number. How do we get there? Can we get there? Not how do we get there? Can we get there?
So it is scientifically possible. It is technologically doable. It is the will of humanity really is what's on the line, or we could call it political will. The question is, we will get there, but will people act only when things get so bad that it's 10 times harder to mitigate the problem? Do we have to have storms like that in Puerto Rico, where a state is still struggling to come out of it and humanity has been damaged in such fundamental ways? Do we need that, plus Houston, plus 100 of the others in the United States, in some of the more powerful countries? Because we will get that, hopefully not too soon. What we need to do, and I often think, I understand the law, I understand the regulation, I understand a little bit about moving capital markets businesses. It's almost a psychological challenge, right? People don't think they've got the power to make a difference, and so they're waiting for somebody else to do it, or they want everybody to do it when they do it. We've got to build that power and that sense of it can be done. But I think it will be hard to do without political will. And I use the word political only because we need to change policy. We need to have a level playing field. We can't have these 42 companies saying, I'll do it, I'm a good guy, and these 64 saying, I won't do it. We need to have a fair and equitable playing field, and I would argue a price on carbon is one way to do that, but where it applies to everybody. There's not going to be a global price on carbon, but we are starting to see in Europe, in many other countries, prices on carbon being put into place. So we need to make them as uniform as we can, but we've got to build, to go back to Auden's start, we've got to build the base of people before they're acting because they've been forced to act. I mean, we've got to look at this. We have a bus channeling coming 80 miles an hour at our children. Any one of us would jump in front of that bus and stop that bus from hurting our kids. We're not stopping it. The bus is coming and we're not jumping. We have got to get to that pitch, not hysterical pitch, but disciplined, focused ability that in everything we do, we're jumping in front of that bus. And it does mean electing the right people, and it does mean taking out the wrong people. And it does mean writing and purchasing and telling the companies that you buy from that you want X. And it does mean if you work someplace, you want the ability to make investments in your 401k. That's about impact investing and social investing, and not just about investing in mutual funds that have every fossil fuel company.
How do you get there? That's, to me, the challenge. You're 100% right. Couldn't agree more. How do you get there? And for me, we're all policy nerds and subsidy nerds, and we know what will work. We know how to do this technically, politically. We have all the tools in the shed. We don't have this movement we need. So more and more, I've been looking at the history of revolution and saying, well, how do revolutions start? How do you get mass movements? They don't just happen. And a great example is the civil rights movement, which is a poor analogy for climate, but there's some things we can learn from it. One is, that When Rosa Parks sat down at the front of the bus, the story that was told in America about Rosa Parks was that she was a seamstress who worked all day and she was really tired. Well, nothing could be further from the truth. She was a trained revolutionary. She went to a school started by a guy named Miles Horton in Tennessee that trained people in how to be civic actors. And another person that was trained there was named Martin Luther King Jr. So we have to start thinking not just what's the price of the carbon tax, but how do we get there to a point where we can achieve that? And who's now running the Highlander schools? Who's getting, because ultimately this is a problem of democracy. That ultimately is partly related to money in politics. But we have a failure of a democracy in America where people feel disempowered. They feel it doesn't matter. They're deeply cynical. They've been let down. I mean, you may hate Trump voters, but they saw nothing changing and they wanted to change something. So to me, it's let's think about those systems and those structures that drive change. Personally, I'm focusing on the outdoor industry as part of that revolution. You're trying to get corporate voice to push on policymakers. You're trying to give a reasonable middle ground. And these are all ways to get there. But we're going to fail on 2 degrees Celsius at the current pace. We have to think differently. We have to try some creative stuff. And one of the things we're also seeing is foundations are really conservative. You know, I think it was MacArthur and another foundation a number of years ago said, we really care about climate, so we're going to throw $500 million or whatever the number was. And they gave it to 2 major NGOs that had failed for 30 years. That's not the fix. You got to try some stuff. You know, this is a bar fight. You throw chairs, you use a bottle, you create chaos, you make noise. You got to do some different things.
It's interesting because when I was at this Green New Deal launch for the Sunrise Movement, these guys get it. I mean, it's deep and it's cultural. That's the other thing, is the cultural aspect of this. They've got their own music, right? They've got their own shirts.
Identity. It's identity.
Identity. And that identity is spreading. They're taking us on a tour of the nation. They got 10 cities that, right, they're going around, and they're hoping you get hundreds more along the way. I think this is a real movement, but I also thought Occupy was a real movement, and I think it kind of boomeranged into Trump voters, you know, these kind of, but in any event.
Well, the Citizens Climate Lobby has chapters across the country now.
Who is that?
Citizens Climate Lobby. They have thousands, hundreds of thousands of members. You know, they're really approaching the level of, you would think, serious clout. And yet, I would say in Washington, they've had almost, you know, negligible impact. They've helped push a lot of politicians into the Climate Solutions Caucus. That's a step in the right direction. But we need some kind of a movement that the politicians will listen to, and not just the politicians on the left. We need to reach out. We need to make sure that we have some politicians from the right who feel like they can be part of the solution as well, because it's going to have to be bipartisan.
So, you know, this is, like, we keep coming back to the darkness of can we do it? It's impossible. It's too hard. I mean, do not underestimate what we're seeing happening across Europe in terms of the student revolution or the youth revolution or the Green New Deal and what it has meant in Congress. I mean, we've got a new young woman congresswoman from New York State, just out of New York City.
Alexandra
Cortez.
AOC.
She is now in Washington. You cannot walk a block without somebody talking about the AOC factor. I mean, it's like LBJ or JFK. We've got this audacious, bright, articulate woman who has helped launch the Green New Deal and give life to it, and people could love what's in it or not. Don't worry about what's on page 62, where there really isn't even a page 62 yet. Look at it for what it is. It's an organizing vehicle. It's brought energy into politics. Mm-hmm. It's bringing energy into every debate that's going on, presidential candidates, gubernatorial candidates. You know, the AOC factor is a very real factor. We can't put all of our marbles in one woman who has been fabulous. But think about, everybody's talking about, I don't know if I could do with that. We got the AOC factor, and you say, you know, she came from nowhere, and she's a force. I think we're seeing more energy, more activity. It doesn't mean we're there. But there is a lot going on that says to me we may be onto something that's bigger and more energetic than we've seen in the past. We've got to help ignite it, help build it, not get caught up in things. People are going to say, oh, but the new Green Deal, it's socialism, it's this and that. Don't worry about what's on every page of the new Green Deal. And as I said, most of it isn't written anyway. It is about the future. It is about what you do with the $8 trillion in infrastructure. It is about thinking about where we're going differently. It is igniting energy and enthusiasm and a spark of hope, and I think we need to help ignite that further and build it.
And it's forcing people who have been on the denier side to step up and say, what's your solution? You say to them, what's your solution? What's your answer, right? And we're starting to see a shift in their rhetoric, which is a positive step.
Well, you've kind of answered this question on top. Based on what you see working, what can the 50 folks in this room do to build momentum? I think you got anything to...
The pressure on
I'd just
balls.
say that, you say, hey, you should write a letter to Congress. And people say, don't write a letter. Don't tell me that and vote. But people don't vote. They don't write letters. So there's this basic kind of carpentry piece. And then the other piece is I think people need to engage more locally. You can serve on planning and zoning boards. You can serve on town council. You can change building codes. That's where democratic movements start. And that basically being an American, doing the thing that you were supposed to do when we created the country. Ben Franklin walks out of the Constitutional Convention and a woman says, Mr. Franklin, what have you given us? And he says, a republic, madam, if you can keep it. And we've failed to keep it. And so there's reviving that. It is calling yourself. The other piece is your congressperson is in town, you go heckle them by asking them a question about climate. They need to hear that voice.
They need to hear it nonstop.
That's what Citizen
Go to every
Citizens
town
Climate
hall.
Lobby,
Exactly.
Protect Our Winners, Ceres, these groups are doing that.
It's interesting because 49 years ago, the bumper sticker was, for the first Earth Day, was what? Think globally, act locally. I really think that's pretty damn good, actually.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
And it's a path to happiness because I'm serious, you're leading a meaningful life now. You're trying to do some good instead of, I'm going to go home and remodel my kitchen. Like it's all about me. That's sort of what we've become in America.
So we really do need a revolution. It's about values. It's about our kids. Either you're on the bus or you're getting run over by the bus. Let's take the last question. Private free market capitalism is divorced from public long-term global problem. Boy, you ask hard questions. How do you fix capitalism so it can solve societal problems? Well, it supposes that you have to fix capitalism, but anybody want to take a shot at that?
Well, I'll just go super quick and then turn it over to you all. Where I came from, Rocky Mountain Institute and other places like that, they say, it's not capitalism, it's that we've never practiced capitalism. So you've got costs to society that aren't included. When you burn diesel, we're not counting the asthma costs. So one, incorporate those externalities, and then second, eliminate ridiculous subsidies that are unnecessary. So we're not practicing capitalism, let's try it.
Yeah, the idea is, so much wealth is collected in certain. We have capitalism.
Capitalism only functions well when it's properly regulated. We cannot ignore
or distributed.
Well, but we also need to redefine. Right now, corporate boards, investors, they have a notion that their mandate, as interpreted, is to generate the quickest returns and the most profitable returns over the long term. And those returns are directly monetary. If, in fact, we rebuild our definition of capitalism, and maybe it's done by changing state law, and maybe it's done by practice, but that running a smart company is about making money and taking care of the people you work with and not unduly contaminating the communities you're in. In the end, they're all about making money. It's just not about short-termism. So redefining that and reestablishing an ethic that you can make money while at the same time being fair to your workers, not polluting places that have no business being polluted, that you're stewards of the future as well as stewards of your quarterly balance sheet. That's where we need to go, and There are bills in Congress. Our own Senator Warren has something to that effect. It's not clear that we'll have to have a federal mandate, but that may be what it takes. How do we rewrite Delaware law, as one example, to talk about the role of the corporation and the obligation of the corporation?
You know, it wasn't always this way. The idea that capitalism is all about serving the profits of the shareholder is a new phenomenon. Even Adam Smith would have told you, you know, the inventor of modern capitalism, that no, that if you ignore the needs of your various constituencies, you're going to fail. So we need corporate executives to do the right thing. Think about it that way. Think about your impact on society. That's how you're going to attract, that's how you're going to be the more successful company, because you're going to attract a workforce that is enthused about working for you because you have values. You know, I teach a class at Duke on leadership, and it's about values. That's what resonates with people. That's what makes people want to follow a leader.
And think about the values that are being, espoused by the leader today, the leaders of the world today. Look at those values.
Well, if your only value is making money for the shareholders, you're missing out.
Or for yourself.
You should be thinking about, how do you serve society? How do you provide a product that people want to buy that improves their lives, enhances their lives, right? And how do you pay enough to your workforce such that you attract quality people that can do the job well and do a better job and make the company stronger and healthier and happier? That means you've got to pay top dollar. I mean, when I ran my business, that was my philosophy. Pay top dollar, get the best people, do the best job for the customer, they reward you with their business, you grow. And it worked.
This capitalism conversation gets at that question you had up there, which is democracy incompatible with long-term problems. Well, if everyone in America voted, we'd be way overwhelmingly in support of action on climate. We'd solve education. So we haven't really practiced democracy that effectively. We've got a horrifically gerrymandered system that has been dominated by money and politics and overrun in the media by fossil fuel money. So democracy itself, even in broken form—
We haven't tried it yet.
We haven't tried it. And when we have solved long-term problems like ozone and vaccination and so forth. So it's another example of great idea, let's try it.
You guys are great. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I had fun. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah.
And he appears as a key figure in the Mueller report. He left the White House last October. Among the 36 topics itemized in the subpoena, the efforts to deny that President Trump wanted Mueller removed as special counsel, potential pardons